Welcome to this conversation on using data to tell the story. This is next set in the Advanced Analytics in Healthcare series. We're going to go through an introduction, and then I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about data storytelling and give you a framework for doing so, but then I've got a whole section of just sort of practical lessons, actual ideas and ways that I use to present data and information. So let's get started. Just a word of warning, I'll definitely contradict myself. I don't always follow these practices, but I know that if I did it, this goes better. I know this from experience, okay? I've learned much of what I've learned through failing or from colleagues who are even better at this than me. And so it's practical lessons, for the most part, that I've learned over time from working to be able to communicate the point I want to an audience, and then not always hitting the mark. Every once in a while I do. And so that's kind of how my knowledge has evolved through this. So not an expert, but a practitioner of it. I just think that's helpful to share. So it started by me looking for a good outline or framework in order to put this into a system so people can follow some steps to do this in a repeatable way. And so I went to look if this already exists, and of course it does. You can find a bunch of these in different institutions, even very reputable ones like Harvard. And so they put it in the sense of like a story, right? Characters, setting, conflict, and resolution, which I think is reasonable, makes sense. Microsoft has one. The way they sort of outline it is build your narrative, use visuals to enlighten, and then show data to support. I think that makes some sense as well. Forbes also has a perspective here: explain, enlighten, engage, and change. Those are all fine. They just don't match very well to my experience of what a repeatable process would look like to do this over and over. And ChatGPT actually did a great job. And so I've built a framework around this structure. First, identify your audience. Okay, it's really helpful for orienting to key communication points, understanding motivations, a number of things. After that, we explore data to find the story. We think about what context we need to set the stage. After that, we have to pause and ruthlessly reflect and look at where have we overdone it, where are we missing the mark. We have to edit, okay? And so that's the keep it simple step, is coming back to make sure that every part of our presentation has a purpose. After that, we can figure out what is our recommendation. And I absolutely encourage that last step, that we always end at a recommendation. So that's the framework I'm going to move forward with. We're going to start with this idea of identifying your audience. We'll move to set the stage, find the story, keep it simple, and make a recommendation. But why storytelling? Why is it always framed this way? Storytelling with data is this process. I've outlined on the left here, conveying a message or a narrative in a way that helps engage the audience. And it's the combination of data and understanding the problem that come together to be able to communicate this. So we start with identifying your audience, okay? Before you can really craft a good story, you need to know who you'll be presenting to. The couple of things that are in my mind as I'm thinking about this, beyond the basics of who is this, is it the nursing group, is it this department, whatever the case may be, I'm thinking about their motivations. Okay, am I presenting information that is encouraging to them, or is this something more like reporting on a place they need improvement? It's important to consider how the message will come across to them, right? If we're coming and sharing, let's say, performance on length of stay to a hospital group, if the group isn't doing very well, we're probably coming. The way it would be perceived is, oh man, I'm not doing well. They're going to ask me to, do something different or do some work, and that might be a frustrating experience. If it's the other direction, that they've actually been performing well, you have a sort of a different approach, different way that you might communicate some of that information. Next piece, based on the audience, is what level of detail is important and necessary. If I've got a more technical audience, I've got a different lens to put on this, but I might actually share some of the detail of how I arrived at what I arrived at, what tools I used. That is going to be completely irrelevant to a practice partner who's a frontline problem solver sitting with patients. They need to know how this impacts them and what it means for their work. So those are some of the considerations as we think about who we're going to present to ultimately. And there's not always one answer. So that is just an orienting piece, okay? Sometimes I'll document it, but often it's just making sure I'm clear on who's going to receive this communication after the fact. So I've got this set up to give us some examples through this framework, okay? You receive the following email. This would be a very common type of email to get from me if you were on my team, okay? The general medicine service line is currently facing some scrutiny regarding their length of stay. Their surgical colleagues have challenged them, suggesting they don't need as many beds as they've been currently utilizing. They believe that reducing their length of stay is going to help decrease the number of beds they use on a daily basis and make room for more patients to receive care from this general surgery service line. Okay, so that's the challenge general surgery has put forward about general medicine, our internal medicine colleagues. But here's sort of a counter, right? However, the general medicine team is pushing back on this notion, arguing that their length of stay, while longer than surgery, doesn't necessarily indicate poor performance. So that's what we know. That one group is challenging the other. We need to gather more data to better understand this situation. So if I'm sending this off to an analyst, I'm saying something like, I'd like to request that you evaluate the current situation regarding general medicine service line patient length of stay. There seems to be a discrepancy between their numbers and those of general surgery's team. I believe we need a thorough analysis to understand the implications. So that's your task. And it starts with identifying your audience. What we can imply from this sort of message is that the issue has been raised, and it would likely be raised to somebody like our hospital leaders. Someone is probably asking for resources, like, hey, I need more beds. I think you need to talk to this other group. So we probably have decision makers that will receive some of our output. We're also going to have to come back to these practice partners and give our analysis to say, here's what we see when we take a look at the data. And I'm sure we need to report back to the group that raised the issue to be able to share what we find about the situation. So this is basic, right? This sounds, oh, well, this is too simple. Why are you wasting time doing this? This helps us think about how we need to present the information. We need to be objective and thorough. We will have multiple perspectives. We will have a group that's probably going to feel defensive. We'll have a group who feels that they already know the answer. Hospital leaders are going to need objectivity. So that's what helps orient us there. Next, let's talk about setting the stage. This is about bringing extra context. Really in this situation, basic SBAR principles can come to play. If you're a nurse or frontline worker in healthcare, you've probably used or received an SBAR before. SBAR is just a documentation pattern where you, when you need to share information with somebody, you make sure that you share the situation so that you're outlining what's happening. Background, any relevant background that's needed to understand the situation better. Assessment is your point of view, what you see here of the scenario, and then recommendation. So this is a way to just more thoroughly share information when you need to pass it along. So those principles are perfect to think about here for what extra context do I need to include to help people engage and understand this information. So this can be different depending on your audience. If the audience is completely unaware of the situation, you have to set the stage more. If that's not the case and the audience understands the context very well, then you can focus in on just the key points. So that's how these pieces of the puzzle fit together, um, I like to bring context often, extra context in. So this would be, for me, an example of, let's not just share the number that was asked. Like someone asks for the number of a certain type of admission. Let's also share, well, what is that as a proportion of the total? What is that as a proportion of, specific incoming streams of patients? That's the kind of context I think always helps put into perspective what it is that a group is talking about. So for me, I'm looking at things like change over time, difference between the practices, or a comparison to some sort of benchmark. I've got some real basic visuals just to put a couple things out here as I explore a data set I have that has some information like this. I would look at the number of admissions between our service lines. I would look at the average length of stay between our service lines, and I would look at the distribution of that length of stay. So this helps me orient to what's the situation, how different are these practices, how is the data distributed, and how has it changed over time. Those are some core questions I'm asking to figure out, is any of this relevant? Another common type of question is, what's changed in the environment? So I am using my practice partners to say, is there a process change or a policy change that might be causing things to look different? So I don't miss some basic element, like, they change locations, they change providers, something like that. So this is exploratory. This is not stuff I'm ready to present out. I'm just getting stuff ready for myself to look at this. After that, it's time to find the story. And so this is not a simple linear process. This is the exploratory cycle of looking for patterns and then critically evaluating whether or not they're relevant, are they important, and are they consistent. And so this is just basically peeling through data to look across different dimensions. How does this measure change? Look across time and interact dimensions as well. Keeping an eye out for things like outliers, things that look really unusual, and tracking down why they happened. Trying to figure out, is there a key message or something that really helps inform on this problem that's been brought to us? So it's about making the whole worth more than just the sum of the parts, because I've seen time and time again that great data scattered without a connecting narrative is just not as useful for human problem solving. It's just how we work. There's even some good evidence behind this, that the brain has this preference for stories because it hits more parts and centers of the brain when you hear a story. So it sticks better. People just understand and hold on to more information when we put it into a narrative structure. So that's why we focus on trying to find a story, what happened, who was there, that kind of thing. So I'll also give you this one out, okay? Because it can be very frustrating when you're looking through data to maybe find that there isn't the signal someone thought there isn't the situation everyone is telling you there is. Sometimes that lack of story is the answer, and it's important to bring that back to say, hey, this doesn't look like people thought, or actually there's not any meaningful change. So let's figure out why the perception might be there, that sort of a thing. So for me, I'm taking a look at this group that's been challenged. I'm looking at their length of stay, and what I see is it's actually stable. And now that's true, but also let's just see, like, well, is stable okay? Like, I'll check it against the other practice, that surgery practice, and what I learned is that their practice looks just really, really different. That surgery in blue on the second visual there is got a much, much lower length of stay. These are two completely different groups. That might be absolutely appropriate. And so my next step is usually to look at the group that's been challenged, length of stay, across some benchmark. So I'll start by looking at what would be the expected length of stay for these patients. That's typically available in multiple different formats at different institutions, the most basic of which is that CMS offers for each hospital stays DRG, a average length of stay that all patients with that DRG have across the country. So that's a most basic place to start, and evaluate to figure out, okay, it's stable. Is stable okay? Are we doing better than what would be expected from typical. Next is one of the hardest parts, okay? This is where we have to keep it simple. This often is the biggest time component of the entire process. Even though you're going to spend a ton of time exploring data to try to figure out what the story is, you often spend even more editing it, whittling it down, making sure you actually found meaningful stuff, okay? So this is trying to get it whittled down to easy to understand language that's really focused on the key message, ensuring that each element you're going to share contributes to that key message and or helps with a little bit of extra context that's needed, using the data to support the message. This is much harder than it sounds. So my approach here is to overproduce in the beginning. So I will just produce some simple slides of all the information that feels relevant or interesting to me, and then come back and I have to just slash, right? You just got to get rid of the stuff that you might have spent a really long time on. And this is really hard because you might have spent hours building a visual that you really quite like. It's very beautiful. Just to find out, hold on, this doesn't actually have a point in the presentation I'm making. It doesn't add to my message. So that is just something that happens here. Now, my typical first round of this is not to throw it away. Don't just delete it. I put it in the appendix so that I've still got it around. It feels less painful, and I can always keep it there to use in conversation if the topic comes up. So what you're looking for is the key message, okay? And you want to make sure that it's tied to the motivations of your audience. This is not simple, but one helping principle is to think about when you choose a visual, what is the goal of the visual? That simple question can often shortcut a lot of this process for me. Just asking, hold on, what am I trying to convey with this visualization? There's also this great format here, ICCOR, that helps because it outlines some of the key goals that are usually meant with visualizations. And there's even a nice list of, if this is your goal, here are the visualizations that typically support it. So I'll share some of those. The key goals that come up in visualization are that you need to inform. You're just trying to convey a simple, important message. Comparison, showing similarities or differences among values. Change would be the other one, trying to visualize a trend over time or space. Organize, being able to put things into perspective for people like rank or order, or to reveal relationships, show correlation or relationship between dimensions, variables, or measures. So each one of those goals has a separate set of visuals that fit it best. On the inform side, you could just be looking for really straightforward things like a big single number to share, or donut chart, or a simple pictograph, something like that. Showing change, you're probably looking for an area chart, a line chart. Timelines could be helpful. Maybe a map chart. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but it could be changeover space, right, that you're showing. Relationships, you're likely looking for a scatter plot, a histogram, or a multi-series chart where you use a bar chart and a line chart together to show two different elements over the same scale, like time, to see how they're changing. If you're trying to compare, that's your key goal, then you have a pretty long list of things that could work. Bar chart, bubble chart, pie chart, word count, stacked bar, bubble cloud, or a tree map. The only caution I'll give, I got it really early in my analytics training. I don't know if I fully understand it yet, but there's a general dislike of pie charts. The human eye seems to have difficulty, especially if there's many categories in a pie chart. I don't know if I fully understand the complete discrimination against it, but there's probably some wisdom to that if you have a lot of categories, you do not want to use a pie chart. So, keeping it simple, you saw all those exploratory visualizations that I looked at before for these groups. I looked at medicine, I looked at surgery, I looked at their performance together, I thought about their performance against a benchmark. For me, just getting to like putting that on one page, I'll probably move towards something like this. Looking at their average length of stay over time for each service line against their benchmark. So on the top in blue, you have internal medicine's average length of stay in dark blue, and in light blue above it is the CMS arithmetic mean. So a benchmark, so what does CMS tell us for patients like this, patients with this DRG? What should their length of stay be, or what is it on average across the country? And we can see that general medicine is doing better. Now, we have a really different profile with general surgery. They are superstars. They have a length of stay that is well below their benchmark for these DRGs and extremely below our internal medicine group. So, the truth is we don't have an obvious signal that medicine is underperforming. They're stable over time and they're below their benchmark consistently. And so the story is starting to come together that, the challenge that was levied might not have very strong grounds. What is possible to be driving this is that these are two really different practices, and our general surgery service line has a really, really strong performance. So that's kind of what I see in getting this to one page for how I understand it. And I would summarize maybe this as saying medicine performance is looking like they're performing well by most common evaluation approaches. Their length of stay is up very slightly, and their observed to expected ratio is actually down. So that is a comparison of their length of stay to that benchmark. Next step is to make a recommendation. The point of this step is to bridge the gap between the data insights that you present and action you believe should be taken from that. So the data can give good insights, patterns, and an understanding of the situation, but it's often not enough to drive change. It may seem obvious to you what should be done about it, but you need to state it. And you need to state it for a few reasons. Number one, you might be wrong. You're just, in the data, and there might be perspectives you did not consider and decisions that should be made different from what you expected. The only way to work towards that is to put it out in front of people and to start debating what would be the right action given the information that you've surfaced. If you haven't arrived at a recommendation yet, you're not done. You probably haven't completed the full process and gone deep enough to understand the situation. I'll give you one out, but you shouldn't take it too often. Your initial recommendation can be that there needs to be a deeper analysis, right? You may identify some leads or some areas that need more data, and it's completely appropriate to say there's interesting patterns that should be explored, and we haven't had time in the first pass. Or there's interesting patterns that should be discovered, but we don't have the data available. We should find a way to just collect it. That is absolutely okay. If that's the sort of place you're going to land, I would try to get there as quickly as possible so that you still, are providing good service to the people that you're trying to help. Here's an example, just so you can see, of what would actually be a good response in my point of view to this challenge that's been levied, okay? A good result for me from that initial email, where I outlined, hey, medicine has been challenged. General surgery feels there's an issue. I actually would preference towards replying really quickly with the very basics of what I've found and try to have my proponents direct me to the right next action because of what I found. What I found is this, the story doesn't hold up. So I put it forward as what's missing? And I even do it without visuals. So this is my point about being ruthless about keeping it simple. I spent all that time exploring. I grabbed a bunch of visuals to understand the context, to look at it over time, look at it across each other, look at it across the benchmark, all of that stuff. None of that is necessary and might not even matter to my end users they've just heard this general complaint levied and they need to understand it. So I would put back something like this. Thanks for sharing that concern. I've reviewed the available data, including the attached visualizations. Maybe I would just attach them so they could see if they were interested in diving deeper. But I'm seeing a different picture from the surgery team's assessment. Length of stay overall increased very little over 24. Observed to expected, actually decreased. So definitely true that medicine's length of stay is higher than general surgery, but the difference could be due to really different patient profiles and case complexities rather than indications of underperformance. Based on these observations, I recommend we share the high-level trends with the surgical team. And then, you don't have to say, we proved you wrong. We see that they're doing fine. You're just idiots. Not a good approach. You can put it forward as, hey, help us understand what we're missing. We want to make sure we can, outline this and put data to it to make good decisions and come to a good recommendation. But we don't see quite the same story. Help us uncover something we missed. What are we not thinking about in this situation? And often you'll get great feedback here. Number one, you might get the feedback where they say, okay, well, I didn't really look at the data. I just was experiencing this. That's pretty common, actually. And the other type of feedback you might get is, you're not thinking about the overall institution performs far better than the benchmark, and medicine should be doing the same. They may have a point of view like that could be legitimate as well. So, my preference on a issue like this would be to respond very rapidly with the basic high-level findings and open up the question to what are we missing? What don't we understand about this situation to help do better with it? So, that's kind of full life cycle on a basic question and walking through this process to figure out how to present out an answer. Okay. Now we're going to transition, and I'm going to share some practical lessons I've learned over time for presenting data. The first one is to uncover elements as you go to direct attention. Here's an example where I needed to share a modeling approach, and I start by talking about how we define the different sources into our system and why that was important, why this approach was helpful. Next, I wanted to discuss how I built levers into the modeling. Instead of point estimates of assumptions, I made levers so the users of this model, could toggle those assumptions and find out how the result would change or react. And since I've uncovered that, now I've got their attention thinking about those levers, and we discuss what that is. And next I uncover the result. We are going to then have projections from how I outline these sources, and you have the ability to change the levers and see what changes in the projections. So this is me sharing a modeling approach and how they'll be interacting with it by uncovering piece by piece and keeping their attention just on the element I want to discuss, instead of just pulling this slide up and talking straight through it.
Okay, next we want to use animation only when we have a clear purpose. It seems like as soon as people get familiar with or start to learn that you can animate items on slides, they really overuse it. So I'll show you an example where I found like a pretty clear purpose for why I would want to use it. Just to demonstrate, I think, one example at least of actually having a reason for animation. So here's an example where I needed to share a modeling approach, and I was working with a non-technical group, but I just needed to demonstrate this simple concept that we were modeling over history to see for all of the patients that come to the ICU, we check for their first transfer and how many of those end up needing a PCU bed after that. And so it's just sort of this basic translation of those 100 patients that came to the ICU, 13 of them went to the PCU. And the next step in the modeling is we check second transfers of patients, and that there's some potential that even of those 13, some may have a need to come back to the ICU. So that's just one example where I needed to demonstrate the movement of patients through these different kind of checkpoints in the modeling approach. I found it useful. It seemed to drive some understanding. But that's a situation where I had a really clear purpose and why I wanted to use animation, not just because it made my slides look better.
Use highlights to direct attention. Another way of just keeping people focused where you want them focused. You might have a slide that's important to share all the detail of, and that you would actually want it all on the screen so they can navigate. But as you guide the discussion, you want to pull their attention to what you're talking about. So, hey, first we're going to talk about the assumptions I've set. Here they are. Now let's talk about the outcome of that decision. So you can see how I'm just using that sort of highlighting to keep their attention where I want it. Another piece I'll give you is to think about like the elevator pitch that your leaders or the people you're presenting to will leave the meeting with. So you want to leave your audience with some sort of key figure or fact that they'll keep that's kind of impactful and summarizes the whole message that you have. So here's an example. I can't show you the visual, but where I had a nice graph of admissions, and I needed to share that they were reduced. Had a nice graph of length of stay. I had to share that it was increasing. And then I had a graph of census. All these things are connected. And I had to share that it had changed. It was up a little bit over time. But I ended with this. I ended with a summary of those three things together that they saw with just a key fact in each of those elements. Admissions are up by this much, down by this much, length of stay is up by this much, and as a result, census is up by this much. So this was me demonstrating the key point, so I've got 3 slides to share the detail and talk about what's changing in each of those, but I want them to leave with this: admissions down, length of stay up, census up. So it's giving them that elevator pitch to understand the key message of what I wanted to share. Another one is to utilize reference lines to force perspective. This is an example where we were sharing a change or a shift in the distribution of a grouping, and on its own, without the yellow lines that are there in the middle, you just see noise. You really don't see anything really. So we added these yellow lines just because we wanted to point out that the green grouping is a grouping of 8 to 14 day length of stay from 2020 to 2022 was shifting left, or basically becoming a bigger proportion of our discharges. And so that was the message we wanted to make sure we forced, but it did not come across when we just had this visual on its own. Forcing that perspective with the reference point was really useful. So that's a lesson I can hand over. The next one I've got is to add context every time that it helps. So an example I'll give you. You may know that some change happened within this visual, but there's a big difference between knowing it happened and even talking about it happening. You might even point to it happening and showing where it happened and when it happened. So you're looking at the same visual, but now I've got in front of it, behind it rather, the context of when a change took place. We took this effort in August or whatever the case may be, and here is what happened after that change. So making a point to include where something happened, it can be really meaningful, especially with the time element. Okay, next, utilize reference visuals to keep a contextual thread across multiple slides. So often you'll want to share a lot of information about some structure. So here's an example where we're talking about 3 pillars of information and also a foundation underneath it. So now you can imagine there's probably, 5, 6, 7, 10 slides about these that I'm going to talk about next. In order to just keep the audience guided and within the map of where I'm trying to share ideas, I take the visual that we had from this first page and I put it in the upper right hand corner and I highlight what section we're on. So this we're going to talk about this foundational data layer. And, I share whatever it is that I wanted to share about that. Next, we're going to talk about pillar 1. And I've got my slide to outline and discuss what's going on in pillar 1. After that, we talk about pillar 2, and we outline and show pillar 2. And then we're going to talk about pillar 3. So we outline and share pillar 3. So it's a simple tactic to guide understanding about a long series of information. Imagine if there's 3 slides on each of these, really easy to get lost across 12 slides, or for kind of lose the thread of where we're at in the discussion. But this sort of visual can be really, really impactful for that. Last few tidbits, just little things. Keep a deep index. I've had a patient, and then you see the little sub bullet there, anticipate Jason. So I had a teacher that always said it this way. He must have had someone in his life he really did not like named Jason. And so he would teach this as always, think about what Jason's going to say. Because there's always a Jason in the back of the room that's going to bring up that really annoying point that is hard to explain, or could undermine what you've just said. And Jason will bring it up. So he's going to say, well, you guys forgot about this. You forgot about that. If you can anticipate those ahead of time, do it. Put it into the appendix. So it might not be part of your main point, but it is, I got to tell you, it's a game changer when that comes up in a meeting and you jump to a slide that you already had ready for it. It tells people, whoa, these guys are on top of it. They've thought of everything. So often, if you have it ready, you're fortunate enough it works out that way. This only happens once, and people stop challenging immediately once that happens. So that's a super move to try to do. This is part of what we talked about before, where I overproduce, I edit, but I don't throw stuff away. I put it into the appendix in my sort of just in case box there. And then this last part is frustrating but true. Over and over again, give yourself double the time to organize and create the presentation as you took to create the information. That seems obnoxious. It is. But it's just come through true over and over again for me. And the more I embrace this, the better my communication and presentation goes. Okay, so that's it. If you're gonna do this kind of work, I think I think it's useful to have a framework to try to have some reproducible results, where you start by orienting with who's my audience, who am I presenting to, set the stage for whatever extra context is needed, find the story of what's important to this problem, then you got to edit. Keep it simple. Got to boil it down to just the important points and end with a recommendation. I've also shared some of these practical lessons that can be very useful. I've learned over time for being impactful with your presentations. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you sitting with me and listening to my perspective on this.